You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. The Zimbabwean military has seized control of the country and detained President Mugabe. Will this present an opportunity for Zimbabwe's opposition parties?
In this episode of Travelogue, we explore Guangzhou on the Pearl River Delta. We'll discover how family clans shaped this city's fortunes and how the spirit of change turned it into a modern-day economic powerhouse.
From emerging powers to expanding partnerships, from fighting poverty to combating climate change, booming economies, war-ravaged nations, and everything in between. We capture the changes affecting the most dynamic and diverse continent on the planet, taking you beyond the headlines to the people and their stories. Asia Today, delivering Asia to the world.
We have come a long way. Changes happen, and fast, from all corners, different lives, voices, and visions. Encouraged to think, enlightened to change. World Insight with Tian Wei go beyond the headlines. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. Zimbabwe's military seized the control of the country and confined President Mugabe and his wife early on Wednesday, saying the act was targeting criminals around the president. The country's ruling party and the African Union made a joint statement on their social media platforms, stating daily life has returned to normal under the current situation. Indeed, the crisis has not disrupted the lives of the Zimbabweans. A few roads are still under military control, but traffic in the capital, Harare, is back to normal. Let's take a look at the latest.
It is hard to say whether the recent political upheaval is the ancient grudge between 93-year-old Robert Mugabe and his obedient aide of 40 years, Emmerson Mnangagwa, or if it's the consequences of an unbalanced relationship between government and military. After being sacked as vice president and dismissed from the parliament this week, Mnangagwa decided to snap back, and quickly. He called in a favor from his close ally in the army, Defense Force Commander General Constantino Chiwenga, and put the president in house arrest on Wednesday. Another key figure at the center of the storm is the president's second wife, Grace Mugabe, who depends solely on her husband's support in her political ambitions. Grace is not very respected among Zimbabweans, but she has shown great confidence in getting elected as vice president as soon as her husband survived the little bump. Mugabe himself is also running for the 2018 elections, despite being under house arrest. Looking back on his rule of almost 4 decades, Mugabe seems to have a way of getting out of political turmoil. In the 2008 elections, Mugabe's ZANU-PF party lost its parliamentary majority. He was defeated by opposition leader Morgan Tsvangirai in the presidential vote. Mugabe was forced to form a power-sharing government and named his rival as prime minister. But Tsvangirai never managed to dent ZANU's dominance. In 2013, Mugabe's party abolished prime minister's post and passed a new constitution. But the recent political crisis has given the opposition hope again, and they're planning to continue their democratic campaigns once Mugabe is out of the picture.
And for more on Zimbabwe's political crisis, we are joined by Mr. Mwenda Bijiwe in Nairobi. He is the security consultant and CEO of Eye on Security. Meanwhile, we're also joined in the studio in Washington and Beijing, Ms. He Wenping, professor at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences And also in Washington, D.C., Emerald Woods, Associate Fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. It's a consultant and strategist from the International Working Group, Africa's Rising for Justice, Peace and Dignity. A very long title, but I hope we would help our viewers know better about your background. Let me go to you, Mr. Bijiwe, first, about the latest situation in Zimbabwe. What do you say? Is it a political struggle, or is it a different way of looking for a different future of the country?
I think Zimbabwe has come, around the circle of revolution, and the country has gone through a lot of stress, especially in the last decade. But I think the leadership of Zimbabwe, especially as was accorded by military leaders and supported by the political class that believes the nation should move forward, I think they took a proper decision to decide that, hey, it's time to help President Mugabe to retire. And as you know, they said it's not a military coup, so let's not call it so.
All right.
And they said it's helping deal with the criminals. So they brought the right decision on the table.
We're going to have the others to comment about that, but what they say is not necessarily going to be the exact the fact as everybody would accept, whether it's a coup or not. Some say it has all the symptoms of it. Others suggest, well, it's an issue that the country has to deal with yourself. But having said that, though, does a change of a leadership at the very top, for example, not President Mugabe, but the vice president coming back to office, necessarily going to change the future of the country for the better? Mr. Bijiwe?
What I think is, you see, the handlers of President Mugabe might not have understood the intrinsic relationship between the regime of Mugabe and the military. And when they removed the vice president, then they made a miscalculation, because this is the man that had been holding, together the military. Because looking at the strain, political strain that Zimbabwe has gone through, and the top class, world class discipline that the military has maintained in Zimbabwe, then you wonder who has been able to control the military. And so removing the deputy president was a great miscalculation on the side of the handlers of the president. And therefore you saw the reaction was fast and furious from the military, and the same man they removed from deputy presidency is going to assume the presidency now.
Of course, the military has been controlling the country. The vice president has been in a very close relationship with the military. But when the military is more in power or back in power, when the vice president is back in power, does it mean the country is getting better? We do not know about that. Having said that, though, Mr. Bijiwe, I want to ask you another question, which is concerning the economy of the country. We see a country that has been rising out of independence movement that should be congratulated from all over the world. However, over the past few decades, the economy not doing well at all. The high inflation, we all know. And meanwhile, there's also so-called the second revolution going on in the country, taking away the properties of the white farms and not necessarily going to the hands of those who need it, but rather to what they call ruling class. So what will all of this mean for the future, particularly if there is a change at the top leadership?
If you listen to the statement that the military made, where they said previously, that is on the 13th of November, that was, I would call it the first shot that they made to changing the regime. They said, we are cognizant of the revolutionaries and the people that brought the revolution, and they said to protect the revolution that brought freedom to Zimbabwe in the early 80s, we are going to do anything as the military to protect that revolution. So if you look at the statements that the military has made, they are more nationalistic. That is why you see the calmness in the country. The citizenry are not revolting. There has not been any demonstrations or anyone saying, no, we don't like the change. Looks like everyone is agreeing with the military that this is nationalism that we need to hold the country together, but to move the country forward by changing the political leaders. And I think President Mugabe really, really made a miscalculation in his leadership. He failed to know when to leave the stage and it's bad that his sons had to remind him when to leave the stage.
I see. Mwanda Bijiwe, coming from the Eye on Security from Nairobi. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us. Thank you, really appreciate it. Let me go to the other two panelists. You've been attentively listening to Mr. Bijiwe earlier. Of course, your time to talk about your thoughts. Ms. Woods, you are coming to us in Washington. I wondered what are the views there, and also how would that necessarily, the current development, help us to understand the future of and the nature of change in Zimbabwe? Ms. Woods.
Well, I think the first thing we have to say clearly is that this is a coup in Zimbabwe, and what you have seen from the African Union, from the Southern Africa Regional Group, SADC, is a real concern because these bodies, by mandate, do not seat governments that come to power through military coup. So this is a coup, we should call it that, and that's clear. Right. But what you also see is a level of real kind of a wait and see attitude in the streets of Zimbabwe, and you have not seen the opposition leaders speaking out, the trade union leaders, the faith-based leaders, those that you know will be watching this situation quite closely. Are a bit, behind the scenes at the moment. But I suspect we will see that in the coming days. I think when it comes to Zimbabwe, the U.S. and the U.K. have played often a detrimental role, wanting to bring about regime change from the outside. And I think clearly what you have in Zimbabwe is a highly educated citizenry that is really focused on maintaining a future of stability for the country that brings economic well-being for all, that also gives Zimbabweans an opportunity to choose their leaders freely and hold those leaders accountable. So I think you will see in the coming days much more commentary, particularly from those forces inside the country, as they watch to see what takes place with the negotiations that are currently underway within the country now with countries neighboring like South Africa.
Yeah. Ms. He, right now there are those coming into the country of Zimbabwe. For example, the South African delegation is there. Meanwhile, the African Union is watching very closely. There's also something called the South African Regional Community who are watching this situation very closely. Of course, they will have a say about what to do with Zimbabwe from their perspective on the issue of bilateral relations and regional relations. But within Zimbabwe, what do you think are the forces likely to decide the future of that country?
Of course, the first job they need to do is to consolidate this event, these consequences. For example, I have heard that Robert Mugabe himself now refused to step down. No. He still regarded himself as the president, even though now a special envoy delegation has been sent from South Africa all the way to meet him. So the struggle, it seems, still going on, but I don't think from the side of the Mugabe and his wife, they have this kind of capacity or have this kind of power to rewind this trend. Right. So it seems they have already out of their historical picture. So the same for the new emerging leader. I think they need, first of all, they need to explain what's going on about this to AU and to South Africa.
That's right.
To
Otherwise, they have sanctions against the country who are having military coup, and they wouldn't accept them into the decision-making process for the region anymore.
Yeah, because AU has the principle there. They have to make it things equal to every country. You cannot say you are not cool, but other countries. Yeah. So they have to make it clear, saying what's going wrong in this country, what kind of right thing you have been doing, because they are saying they are bringing the country now to the right track. It seems before it's in the wrong track. So what's wrong? So this
and what are the right tracks that they are talking about?
This is it they need to do. So first, get those sympathy and all those recognition from especially laboring countries and the AU.
At this point, Ms. He, other countries in the other parts of the world, including the UK and the US, as Ms. Woods earlier mentioned, are quite restrained from openly commenting about the nature of the incident taking place in Zimbabwe. Is it about giving Zimbabwe a chance to figure it out on its own so that the people there would believe that they are holding their own fate? Or is it about some of behind the scenes going on that would eventually have an impact into the country?
I think both maybe. They have now very complicated thinking right now. First of all, because all the events in Zimbabwe come in a sudden way. So this is out of people's expectation because all those similar stories has been taken place before. But it seems Robert Mugabe can always resolve all those crises ahead of him. But this time around, and then he failed. So even for those Western countries, they need to take some time to digest this story. They also don't know very well about this new leader, that's deputy president.
We do not know whether he will be the new leader either.
Yes.
Even though there were proposals coming
and also
from the
not
military.
so clear about his policy and his attitude towards East or the West country. So that needs time. And another consideration probably maybe because they have been regarded Robert Mugabe as the dictator for a long time. They want him go. If in a very short time they cheer up, which sounds like okay, maybe this is a thing you have been dreamed for, you have been even walked behind, so they want to get rid of that, keep some distance from this kind of accusation.
Interesting. Having said that though, Ms. Woods, the figure, the personality, and the character of Robert Mugabe is an extremely thought-provoking one. I mean, he was the leader in the guerrilla war against the colony. And he won the support of the country as a result of that, and also his respect of the international community, particularly from the developing economies. But then, as time goes by, you see a man in power has been doing things that not necessarily going to concur with his previous image. What do you make of that?
Without a doubt, we have Robert Mugabe as the liberation leader. He is someone who is seen as having brought his country out of the racist apartheid regime. Remember, you know, it was first called Rhodesia, controlled by the British and had a British, you know, Ian Smith ruling the country. And so you had a liberation force and a liberation leader in Mugabe that essentially ousted minority white rule in Rhodesia, what was then Rhodesia, renamed it to Zimbabwe, and brought liberation to the people. You also had an international community, particularly the UK and the US, really renege on promises of liberation, promises to, in one case, to help fund land reform measures within Zimbabwe, and those promises were not kept. The resources were not provided as were agreed under the discussions for independence of Zimbabwe. So you had the international community, geopolitical actors not doing their part and not being good citizens to some extent in that regard. So I think what you had was a quick kind of positioning of particularly the US and the UK in opposition to Mugabe over the last few years, and a real fissure with the international community. So I think there's been a lot of stigmatization of Robert Mugabe. Some of it is warranted with the human rights violations, particularly in the 2008 elections and post-elections. But some of it really, you know, those who were the supporters of Mugabe in the liberation period see as a bit unfair in that the international community didn't play its part in the post-independence era.
Ms. He, there are enormous amount of comparison that you would read in the media between Mr. Mugabe, Robert Mugabe, and also Nelson Mandela. Of course, the latter coming from South Africa. People are talking about their leadership style, their past history, their way of dealing with the power and their relationship eventually with the state. Do you think those two figures are comparable in any way?
Well, I don't think they are comparable because from you know, the Mandela has been the worldwide recognition, the great man, and because one thing he is quite different with all other African leadership, that is, he stepped down voluntarily just by finishing the first term as the president, because he knows his age is high, and he knows that there are others maybe more capable to run the economy, not himself, because he spent such a long time, like 27 years in jail, and he is the symbolic figure for leading the people, like go through out of this apartheid regime. Right. But he knows himself. He also has the limitation. Maybe he doesn't know too much about the economic issue. But for the Robert Mugabe, it's different. Even though both of them, they have led the people and then to get rid of those colonization and also like apartheid. But for the President Mugabe, and he stick to the power for such a long time, 37 years.
That's right.
And he always, even until today, he said he refused to step down. So too long time for the power, and even wants to pass this power to his wife. I think this is the thing eventually bring himself to this situation.
Right. You see there's an ultimate issue of so-called leadership of the revolution vis-a-vis the leadership of governance. Ms. Woods, you see those stories repeated in many different parts of the world. The power and the capacity issue, the greed, the ego, and also the selfishness of a politician should be. Ms. Woods, how is that reflected in this story? Very briefly from you.
Well, you know, I think we have had leaders, particularly in the African context, whether it's Patrice Lumumba in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, you have had Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, you have had leaders who came to power with the power of movements, of people, of popular movements supporting them, trade unions and faith-based groups across the board supporting them, and these leaders saw themselves as one with the masses, with the movements, with the people. I think Mugabe may have started out that way, and certainly Mandela was that way. But Mugabe, over time, you know, began to seek his own personal interests. And we don't have to look to the African context, right? It's in many countries around the world. Again, whether it's the United States where I am now, or China and many other places where you see, you know, people seeking their own interests or the interests of their families at the expense of the people. And so I think it is because of this sense of inequality and injustice, as well as, you know, human rights violations and economic, you know, concerns, that I think you have seen people really waiting to see what will happen with this transition in Zimbabwe today.
That's true. We are looking forward to see what's next. Emerald Woods, He Wenping, thank you so much for being with us. Of course, our best wishes to the country and the people of Zimbabwe. Thank you. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tianwei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.